In the early decades of the 20th century, the United States faced a profound social and cultural debate over alcohol. Public discourse was dominated by reformers, religious leaders, and civic organizations who argued that alcohol was a source of moral decay, domestic violence, and social disorder. This movement, rooted in decades of temperance advocacy, culminated in the enactment of national laws aimed at restricting its consumption. By the end of 1919, the ratification of the 18th Amendment, coupled with the passage of the Volstead Act, established a legal framework that prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages across the nation. The decision to impose a nationwide ban on alcohol reflected a combination of moral ambition and social engineering. Reformers envisioned a disciplined, sober society in which public behavior. Prohibition as a national policy began as law on January 17, 1920, when the ratification of the 18th Amendment and the implementation of the National Prohibition Act, commonly called the Volstead Act, moved the United States from a long-running temperance campaign into a legally enforced ban. The 18th Amendment itself prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors for beverage purposes. It did not criminalize private possession or personal consumption in explicit terms. The Volstead Act, passed by Congress to give the amendment operational force, defined intoxicating liquors and set rules for enforcement. The law's technical definition, anything containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, placed a practical limit on what could be produced and sold legally, and it created regulatory categories for medicinal, industrial, and sacramental alcohol. Those exceptions were legally significant and would prove central to how the policy functioned in practice from day one. The legal change in 1920 was the climax of a movement whose roots extended back into the 19th century. Temperance societies formed in the 1820s and 1830s argued for moderation and abstinence. Civic organizations and religious groups advanced moral, public health, and social order rationales for restricting or eliminating alcohol. By mid-century, some localities and later entire states adopted prohibitionist measures. Maine's statewide law in 1851 is an early and often cited example, so the constitutional ban of 1920 did not appear in a vacuum. In organizational terms, the campaign for a nationwide prohibition coalesced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries around political pressure groups. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League were the two principal organizations that converted temperance sentiment into sustained political action. The Anti-Saloon League, formed in 1893, pursued a focused legislative strategy: elect sympathetic candidates, neutralize opponents, and press for state and federal enactments. That strategy, together with wartime factors and shifting social coalitions, produced the constitutional amendment and its implementing law. World War I accelerated the push toward national prohibition for several concrete reasons. Wartime food conservation policies made grain-intensive beer and spirits a politically sensitive target. Arguments that grain should feed soldiers and civilians rather than be fermented into alcohol gained traction. At the same time, anti-German sentiment weakened the political position of many brewers and saloon keepers, since the nation's largest breweries had been founded and operated by German-American families. A wartime atmosphere that emphasized sacrifice and national unity made the moral language of temperance more persuasive to legislators and voters who might otherwise have resisted. Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in December 1917. State legislatures moved with the urgency of wartime politics, and by mid-January 1919, the required three-fourths of states had ratified it. The period between ratification and enforcement was one of transition. Legislators, executives, and courts had to convert a broad constitutional prohibition into enforceable statutes, regulations, and administrative structures. The text of the 18th Amendment and the subsequent Volstead legislation established the legal frame but did not by itself determine how the policy would be applied on the ground. From the moment the national ban became law, clear fault lines appeared at multiple levels of American political life. One line ran between urban and rural areas. Cities with large immigrant populations, Irish, German, Italian, and Eastern European communities, had long-standing cultural patterns of alcohol use linked to labor, neighborhood social life, and immigrant institutions. In many of these urban neighborhoods, bars and saloons functioned as social hubs, and voters there resisted prohibition on practical as well as cultural grounds. Rural and small-town America, where Protestant reform movements had strong social and political influence, was more likely to favor the ban. The new law, therefore, confronted a country that was geographically divided in consumption patterns and in the social meanings attached to drinking. Another principal division was generational and class-based. Middle-class reformers and civic leaders framed prohibition as a means to reduce domestic violence, increase worker productivity, and protect family budgets. Working-class men and immigrant communities often saw the law as intrusive and culturally alien. The gender dimension was complex. Many women's groups were major proponents of prohibition because they linked alcohol use to domestic abuse and economic insecurity. Over time, significant numbers of women also became opponents of national prohibition when enforcement patterns and social consequences diverged from reformers' expectations. That shift in women's political alignments would have political significance in the later repeal movement. But the immediate moment of legal commencement was still shaped by the earlier coalition that had produced the amendment. Implementation required administrative capacity. The Volstead Act transferred enforcement responsibilities principally to federal agencies and required coordination with state and local law enforcement. It established criminal penalties for the manufacture and sale of beverage alcohol and set the rules under which exemptions could be granted. Physicians could prescribe medicinal alcohol. Priests could use sacramental wine, and industrial users had legal access to denatured alcohol and certain solvent-grade products. Those legal exceptions mattered because they created regulated channels through which alcohol could be moved and, in some instances, diverted into illegal markets. The immediate effect when enforcement began was visible. Thousands of saloons closed, brewery and distillery operations either halted or converted to permitted goods, and a substantial portion of the country's commercial apparatus tied to alcohol production and sale was disrupted almost overnight. The economic consequences of that disruption were both local and national. Before the 18th Amendment, federal and state governments derived significant tax revenue from the legal alcohol trade. The national prohibition removed that revenue stream at a moment when government budgets were expanding in the wake of wartime spending. Businesses tied to brewing, distilling, and hospitality faced layoffs or retooling. Some breweries shifted to producing near beer, soft drinks, or malt extract for domestic use, while distillers sought legal markets in industrial and medicinal alcohol. Workers displaced by the closures found employment unevenly, and local economies that had depended on saloons and related trades experienced a measurable decline in the immediate years after enforcement began. At the same time, the legal shift opened new economic actors to opportunity in the black market for intoxicants, a development that was not fully anticipated by many proponents of the ban. Legally and politically, the constitutional amendment had a specific scope that produced ambiguities requiring judicial and administrative resolution. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors for beverage purposes. It did not itself prohibit possession or private consumption, nor did it provide precise mechanisms for dealing with state-level divergences. States retained power to implement, supplement, or, in some cases, enforce the federal prohibition through their own statutes. Consequently, variations in enforcement and regulatory detail appeared quickly. Some states, counties, and municipalities had already had prohibitory laws and simply folded into the federal framework. Others, particularly in the South and West, adopted stricter interpretations or added local penalties. Urban jurisdictions with more robust local policing capacity sometimes concentrated enforcement on bootleggers and large-scale producers, whereas small towns often saw selective enforcement or local political compromises that permitted a degree of continuing alcohol use. Public reaction in the first months and years was neither uniform nor static. Surveys of contemporary newspapers, municipal records, and court dockets from 1920 demonstrate widespread noncompliance in urban centers, alongside fervent compliance in many rural districts. Consumption patterns shifted in the short term. Estimates compiled by public health officials and trade observers in the early 1920s generally indicate a decline in officially recorded alcohol consumption immediately following enforcement, coupled with increases in unregulated and home production. Home distillation and private consumption in social clubs or private homes quickly became a feature of post-Prohibition life. The legal channels created for medicinal and sacramental use provided loopholes that were exploited by commercial interests and private citizens alike, and the administrative challenge of policing millions of potential violations proved larger than the federal enforcement apparatus had been designed to handle. Culturally, the imposition of national prohibition altered public behavior and social spaces. Saloons, which had been formal spaces for male social life and municipal commerce, disappeared from many street corners, but they were in many places replaced by private clubs, informal gatherings, and new kinds of social venues. The commercial adaptation of breweries and distilleries showed the capacity of the industry to shift product lines, yet those shifts did not absorb the entire workforce displaced by the legal ban. The symbolic language of prohibition, the idea of a national moral correction, remained potent for its supporters even as practical obstacles and social resistance emerged in everyday life. Political consequences were immediate as well. Elected officials at the city and state levels faced increased pressure to define their enforcement priorities. Judges and juries confronted a flood of cases involving the sale and transport of alcohol, and federal administrators had to build an enforcement apparatus quickly. The new federal role in regulating a previously private market expanded the administrative state and set precedents for how moral policymaking would be operationalized through federal legislation. At the same time, the political alignments that had produced the 18th Amendment, religious reformers, rural voters, elements of the progressive movement, remained influential in shaping rhetoric and early policy choices, even as their capacity to control outcomes on the ground proved limited. From the moment national prohibition began, therefore, the United States moved into a complex and contested experiment. Law, administration, economy, and culture all adjusted to a new legal framework that aimed to eliminate an item of everyday consumption by criminalizing its commercial production and distribution. The immediate months after January 17, 1920, demonstrated how legal change can outpace administrative capacity and how constitutional language encounters practical limits when applied to mass social behavior. Enforcement would require resources, political will, and local cooperation. None of those elements were uniform across the states. The structural tensions visible at the outset, urban versus rural enforcement capacity versus social practice, legal exceptions versus enforcement integrity, would shape the entire period that followed, and they established the factual groundwork for examining how the policy evolved in the decade after the law's enactment. Prohibition, beginning in January 1920, required a vast enforcement apparatus to regulate and police the production, distribution, and sale of intoxicating liquors across the United States. The Volstead Act, formerly the National Prohibition Act, provided the legal framework for enforcement, but the practical application fell to federal agencies, principally the Prohibition Unit, which was later incorporated into the Bureau of Internal Revenue under the Treasury Department. From the outset, this enforcement apparatus faced structural and logistical challenges, as it was expected to monitor a vast, diverse nation while policing a product that had previously been socially and economically pervasive. The Volstead Act itself created specific definitions, rules, and exceptions, which required meticulous administrative oversight. It stipulated that beverages containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume were illegal for consumption, sale, or transport for beverage purposes, while medicinal, sacramental, and industrial uses were permitted, creating both operational guidelines and legal ambiguities that would become central to enforcement complications. The Prohibition Bureau began operations with a severely limited workforce. Initial staffing consisted of fewer than 1,500 federal agents tasked with monitoring the entire country, including major urban centers, industrial regions, and remote rural areas. Enforcement duties included investigating illegal distilleries, inspecting shipments, raiding speakeasies, and processing violations through the judicial system. This numerical constraint meant that coverage was uneven and enforcement priorities had to be set, often leaving large segments of the population effectively unmonitored. The Bureau also had limited funding, which constrained mobility, investigative capacity, and the procurement of technical equipment needed to identify illicit alcohol production. Administrative offices had to manage records, oversee permits for legal exemptions, and coordinate with other federal, state, and local agencies to prosecute violations. The mismatch between legislative ambition and administrative capacity became evident almost immediately as illegal production and distribution continued despite the legal prohibition. State governments played a critical role in shaping enforcement patterns. Some states, particularly those with strong temperance traditions in rural areas, allocated resources to support federal enforcement and passed complementary state laws to increase penalties or broaden investigative authority. Other states, often urban and ethnically diverse, refused to dedicate significant personnel or funding to prohibition enforcement. This variance in cooperation created a patchwork system, with enforcement intensity differing dramatically from region to region. Counties, municipalities, and local law enforcement agencies exercise discretion in enforcement, sometimes prioritizing larger criminal operations while ignoring minor infractions or smaller operators. In many urban jurisdictions, police departments faced political pressure to accept informal arrangements with saloon owners and other alcohol-related businesses, resulting in inconsistent application of the law. This uneven enforcement created incentives for illegal production and distribution, as entrepreneurs and organized criminal networks learned to exploit gaps in oversight. The Volstead Act included specific provisions for legal exceptions, which became operational pathways that shaped enforcement challenges. Medicinal alcohol could be prescribed by physicians, and pharmacies were allowed to dispense whiskey for therapeutic purposes. Sacramental wine could be distributed to religious institutions, and industrial alcohol, denatured for non-beverage purposes, could be purchased legally by manufacturers. These legal channels became vulnerable to diversion, and scrupulous actors found ways to redirect industrial or medicinal alcohol to illegal markets, often with falsified paperwork or complicit intermediaries. Enforcement agents had to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate use, a complex task complicated by inadequate staffing and limited laboratory testing capabilities in the early years. Moreover, courts and prosecutors faced the challenge of adjudicating cases that hinged on the interpretation of the law's nuanced exceptions, leading to inconsistent rulings and variable deterrent effects. Quantitative data from the early years illustrates the scale of the enforcement challenge. By 1921, federal agents had raided thousands of clandestine breweries and distilleries, but these actions represented only a fraction of illicit operations nationwide. Estimates indicate that by 1922, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 large-scale illegal production sites were active, with tens of thousands of smaller, unregistered operations dispersed across urban neighborhoods and rural counties. Confiscated alcohol volumes were substantial but insufficient to reduce overall consumption significantly. For example, federal reports from 1922 document millions of gallons of beer and spirits destroyed or seized, but contemporaneous surveys suggest that illicit supply kept pace with demand in many metropolitan areas. Enforcement statistics also reveal the administrative bottlenecks. Court dockets were overwhelmed, prosecutions were delayed or dismissed, and prison systems struggled to accommodate an increasing population of alcohol-related offenders. The federal enforcement apparatus developed organizational procedures to maximize its limited capacity. Agents were assigned to geographic districts, prioritized investigations based on perceived threat or scale, and relied on informants to identify large-scale operations. Early on, the Bureau created inspection protocols for shipments entering ports and crossing state lines, attempting to intercept smuggled liquor. Surveillance, undercover operations, and collaboration with postal inspectors became routine methods for detecting violations. Despite these strategies, enforcement faced structural weaknesses. Agents were outnumbered by violators, often poorly trained in investigative techniques, and susceptible to bribery or intimidation by organized criminal actors. Administrative oversight was also inconsistent, with headquarters in Washington, D.C., issuing directives that were difficult to enforce uniformly across distant field offices. Local resistance compounded federal limitations. In many cities, police departments prioritized other criminal activity or accepted informal agreements with proprietors of speakeasies and illicit breweries. Jury nullification became a widespread phenomenon. Juries frequently refused to convict defendants in alcohol cases, reflecting local sentiment and cultural attitudes toward drinking. Municipal officials in ethnically diverse neighborhoods often considered prohibition enforcement politically sensitive, aware that aggressive policing could disrupt communities and provoke public backlash. This divergence between legal requirements and social practice produced a climate in which law enforcement was selective, uneven, and at times performative rather than functional. The legal exceptions of the Volstead Act were particularly consequential in the first years of enforcement. Medicinal prescriptions for whiskey became a major source of supply for consumers who would otherwise have been prohibited from accessing alcohol. Licensed pharmacists were permitted to sell regulated quantities under physician orders, and this mechanism created a quasi-legal market that federal authorities could monitor but not fully control. Religious institutions received sacramental wine, which, while modest in total volume, allowed some flow into communities for private consumption. Industrial alcohol, denatured and intended for non-consumptive use, was frequently stolen or diverted into beverage channels. These legal pathways demonstrated the practical limits of a law that aimed for universal compliance. The administration had to regulate not only outright illegal production, but also legally permitted avenues vulnerable to exploitation. Training and administrative procedures evolved, but early enforcement lacked standardized methods for laboratory testing, documentation, and evidence collection. Agents frequently had to rely on physical observation, informant testimony, or self-reporting by violators. Coordination between federal, state, and local authorities was hampered by fragmented reporting structures, differing priorities, and political influence. In some areas, enforcement became effectively symbolic, with federal agents visiting sites to document compliance, but lacking the capacity for consistent follow-up or prosecution. In other jurisdictions, enforcement was aggressive and targeted, leading to significant disruption of local supply chains, but also public complaints and legal challenges. Economic consequences of enforcement were immediate and measurable. The closure of breweries, distilleries, and saloons led to widespread unemployment in the alcohol-related sector. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of workers, brewmasters, bottlers, coopers, delivery personnel, and service staff were displaced. Many sought alternative employment in other manufacturing or service sectors, but the transition was uneven, particularly in urban industrial centers. At the municipal level, city governments lost licensing fees and sales taxes previously generated by the legal alcohol trade. The federal government similarly lost an estimated $300 million annually in tax revenue previously collected from beer, spirits, and wine sales. These financial losses placed additional strain on enforcement agencies, which were already underfunded and understaffed. Patterns of noncompliance emerged rapidly. Urban residents, accustomed to regular consumption, adapted to legal restrictions by establishing private clubs, illicit bars, and clandestine production operations. Home distillation became increasingly common, particularly in rural areas with agricultural access to grains and fruits suitable for fermentation. Organized operations developed supply chains that took advantage of regional differences in enforcement intensity. Liquor would be produced in low enforcement regions and transported to cities with high demand but relatively lax policing. Enforcement efforts sometimes displaced production rather than eliminating it, creating a dynamic in which legal intervention reshaped the geography of illegal activity without fully reducing consumption. By the mid-1920s, the Prohibition Bureau faced growing institutional and public challenges. Enforcement statistics revealed an ongoing high level of illegal production and distribution, widespread diversion of legally permitted alcohol, and consistent public resistance. Congressional oversight hearings documented agency inefficiency, administrative shortcomings, and the limitations imposed by insufficient staffing. State governments increasingly negotiated partial cooperation arrangements or scaled back enforcement, while federal agents adapted by focusing on high-volume operations and high-profile violations. The combination of legal loopholes, administrative constraints, and public noncompliance established the operational environment for subsequent developments in bootlegging, organized crime, and the eventual political challenges that would culminate in repeal. The machinery of prohibition, therefore, was a complex, multi-level system attempting to enforce a nationwide ban on alcohol in a society that was partially resistant, economically invested in the industry, and geographically diverse. Federal agencies were required to police production, transport, and sale, while navigating legal exceptions, uneven state cooperation, and insufficient resources. The first years of enforcement revealed structural weaknesses, administrative limitations, and social friction, all of which shaped subsequent patterns of illicit activity and legal response. The period established a precedent for federal involvement in moral legislation, demonstrating both the potential and the constraints of a centralized enforcement apparatus applied to widespread social behavior. The enforcement of prohibition in the United States between 1920 and the mid-1920s coincided with the rapid emergence of a nationwide illegal alcohol market. With legal production, sale, and distribution of intoxicating beverages prohibited, private entrepreneurs and organized groups sought to satisfy the persistent public demand. The prohibition of alcohol created an economic vacuum that incentivized illicit production and distribution, commonly referred to as bootlegging. Bootlegging encompassed a spectrum of activities, including clandestine brewing and distillation, smuggling across international and domestic borders, and retail sale through covert channels. These operations ranged from small-scale, household production to highly organized criminal networks operating across multiple states. The illegal supply network developed in response to both the uneven enforcement of the Volstead Act and the large, sustained consumer base that continued to seek alcohol despite its prohibition. The initial stage of bootlegging often involved home distillation and small-scale operations. Individuals, particularly in rural and semi-rural areas with access to grains, fruits, or other fermentable materials, produced spirits for private consumption or local sale. Estimates from the early 1920s indicate that thousands of small stills operated across the country, often hidden in barns, cellars, or remote wooded areas. These operations were difficult to detect due to their dispersed locations and the relatively small volume of product generated at each site. Federal agents and local law enforcement faced logistical difficulties in identifying and prosecuting such widespread small-scale activity. In many cases, local communities either tolerated or actively protected these producers, reflecting cultural attitudes toward alcohol and the practical limitations of enforcement. Simultaneously, larger, more sophisticated bootlegging operations began to emerge in urban centers and regions with strategic geographic advantages. Industrial-scale illegal breweries and distilleries were established in cities such as Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. These operations produced thousands of gallons of beer and spirits per month, often employing organized labor and logistical networks to transport their products to markets in other cities and states. Smuggling routes extended from Canada across the northern border, from the Caribbean and Caribbean islands into the southern United States, and via maritime routes along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The Great Lakes and Mississippi River systems were particularly important corridors, facilitating the movement of large volumes of alcohol with reduced risk of interception compared to overland routes. Law enforcement frequently underestimated the scale and efficiency of these networks, which combine knowledge of geography, timing, and bribery of officials to maintain operations. The major urban bootlegging enterprises were closely associated with organized crime syndicates. In Chicago, figures such as Al Capone and Johnny Torrio built extensive criminal networks that controlled both production and distribution channels. In New York, Arnold Rothstein and other operators managed similarly complex systems, relying on intermediaries, corrupt officials, and enforcement of territorial control through violence or intimidation. These syndicates implemented hierarchical structures with defined roles for production, distribution, finance, and enforcement of internal rules. The organizational sophistication allowed them to operate at scale while mitigating risks from law enforcement and competing criminal groups. Syndicates often engaged in bribery of law enforcement officials, municipal leaders, and judges, creating a network of legal and political protection that allowed operations to continue even in jurisdictions nominally committed to enforcing prohibition laws. The retail end of bootlegging involved both formal and informal establishments. Speakeasies, covert drinking establishments, proliferated in urban areas and even in some smaller towns. Speakeasies varied in size and sophistication, ranging from small, clandestine bars hidden in residential basements to larger venues integrated into hotels or entertainment complexes. Access was frequently controlled through membership or password systems, designed to prevent law enforcement raids and protect the anonymity of patrons. The proliferation of these establishments was facilitated by consumer demand, the economic incentive for operators, and the availability of products supplied by bootleggers and organized crime networks. Estimates indicate that by the mid-1920s, major cities contained hundreds, and in some cases thousands, of such establishments, demonstrating the scale of the underground drinking economy. Smuggling operations across international borders were particularly important in sustaining supply. Canadian breweries and distilleries provided substantial quantities of beer and spirits, which were transported across the northern border via land routes and waterways. The scale of this cross-border trade varied seasonally, with ice-covered waterways in winter slowing transport along the Great Lakes, while summer months allowed higher volume movement. Similarly, maritime smuggling from the Caribbean supplied southern and eastern ports, taking advantage of limited federal naval resources and the difficulty of monitoring long stretches of coastline. These operations required coordination between producers, transporters, and distributors, highlighting the logistical sophistication achieved by organized bootlegging networks within a few years of Prohibition's enactment. Corruption played a central role in enabling bootlegging. Law enforcement officials at the federal, state, and local levels were often bribed to ignore operations or to provide intelligence regarding raids. Police departments, city officials, and political leaders sometimes received regular payments from bootleggers in return for protection. Court systems were similarly affected. Juries often refused to convict defendants in alcohol-related cases, particularly in urban areas with cultural norms opposed to prohibition enforcement. These patterns of corruption allowed bootlegging networks to expand rapidly, reduce operational risk, and establish enduring control over supply chains. The interplay between legal prohibition, enforcement limitations, and systemic corruption created a durable environment in which illegal alcohol could be produced, transported, and consumed at a scale approaching the pre-prohibition market. The economic incentives for bootlegging were substantial. Alcohol consumption remained high in the early 1920s despite legal prohibition, creating a lucrative market. Profits from illegal sales were significantly higher than pre-prohibition margins, reflecting both the risks undertaken and the scarcity of legal supply. Operators invested in production, storage, and transport infrastructure, employing both skilled and unskilled labor. The capital-intensive nature of large-scale bootlegging reinforced the role of organized crime, as syndicates were able to mobilize financial and human resources more effectively than independent small-scale operators. The concentration of economic power among these networks facilitated the development of monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic control over urban and regional markets, allowing syndicates to enforce territorial agreements and price structures. Violence became a routine component of maintaining and expanding control. Territorial disputes between competing syndicates frequently resulted in armed confrontations. Law enforcement officials and informants were targeted to protect supply chains, enforce compliance, and deter competition. Notable incidents, such as the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, exemplify the lethal methods used to resolve disputes within organized networks and consolidate control over key distribution areas. While high-profile violent events were relatively rare compared to day-to-day enforcement challenges, they symbolized the extent to which criminal networks relied on coercion and intimidation as a means of sustaining operations and managing risk. The public's role in sustaining bootlegging was also significant. Consumer demand remained high, and cultural adaptations facilitated covert consumption. Households, social clubs, and private gatherings provided venues for consumption, creating decentralized demand networks that were difficult to monitor. The persistence of cultural practices, such as communal drinking, celebrations, and social rituals, meant that demand for alcohol was embedded in daily life and social identity. Operators responded to these patterns with tailored distribution strategies, ensuring supply to high-demand neighborhoods and social networks while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. The resilience of consumer behavior was a critical factor enabling the continued operation of illegal alcohol networks. Technological adaptations also influenced bootlegging operations. Industrial equipment, distillation techniques, and transportation innovations allowed producers to scale operations and maintain quality control. The use of refrigeration, concealed storage, and modified vehicles facilitated distribution over longer distances and reduced spoilage, while clandestine laboratory methods ensured consistent potency. These technological measures contributed to the professionalization of bootlegging, blurring the lines between informal criminal activity and organized industrial enterprise. By the mid-1920s, bootlegging had evolved from a fragmented collection of small producers to a network of sophisticated operations with national reach. Legal enforcement continued to interact with bootlegging networks in complex ways. Agents of the Prohibition Bureau focused resources on high-volume operations and prominent syndicates, while smaller-scale producers and local distributors often escaped detection. Judicial interpretations of the Volstead Act and its exceptions introduced additional ambiguity. Cases involving diversion of medicinal or industrial alcohol required detailed evidence to prove intent and illegality, stretching the limited capacity of courts and enforcement officers. Appeals and legal technicalities further slowed the processing of violations, reinforcing the operational security of illicit producers and distributors. Enforcement became selective, resource-dependent, and variably effective, shaping the ongoing structure of the bootlegging economy. The integration of national supply chains, regional control, and urban distribution underscored the systemic nature of bootlegging. Networks relied on coordination across multiple geographic areas, balancing production sites, transport routes, and retail distribution to maximize efficiency and reduce exposure to legal intervention. These operational strategies were guided by intelligence on enforcement patterns, social tolerance, and market demand. Communication networks within syndicates included the use of trusted intermediaries, covert signals, and careful record-keeping to manage both supply and financial flows. The professionalization of these networks mirrored legitimate business practices in organization, risk management, and logistics, even as their activity remained illegal. Bootlegging had broader social and economic implications. It reinforced existing inequalities by concentrating wealth and power among organized crime syndicates while displacing legal industry workers. It contributed to patterns of corruption within political and law enforcement institutions. It also affected public perceptions of legality and compliance, highlighting the limits of law when imposed against persistent social demand. Bootlegging operations became a central feature of the Prohibition era, shaping urban life, criminal organization, and federal policy in ways that extended throughout the 1920s. The operational knowledge, logistical networks, and social adaptations established during these early years of bootlegging would have lasting effects on the regulation of alcohol, the organization of crime, and the broader political and economic landscape of the United States during Prohibition. The emergence of bootlegging, therefore, illustrates the interplay between legal prohibition, enforcement capacity, social demand, economic incentive, and organized crime. The patterns established in the early years of Prohibition, including clandestine production, smuggling, urban speakeasies, and territorial control by syndicates, demonstrate how a law intended to eliminate an economic and social activity instead generated a parallel illicit economy of comparable scale and complexity. These developments set the stage for the subsequent social, economic, and political consequences of Prohibition, including widespread public resistance, shifts in political alliances, and eventual reconsideration of the national policy in the years leading to repeal. Prohibition in the United States between 1920 and 1933 had profound social and economic consequences that unfolded quickly as the nation adapted to the legal ban on intoxicating liquors. The policy, intended to improve public health, reduce social disorder, and increase moral discipline, confronted a reality in which alcohol consumption had deep cultural, economic, and social roots. The enforcement of the Volstead Act and the closure of legal breweries, distilleries, and saloons had immediate and measurable effects on government revenue, labor markets, and the broader economy, as well as on patterns of consumption and public behavior. Economically, the legal elimination of the alcohol trade deprived federal, state, and local governments of a significant source of tax revenue. Before Prohibition, excise taxes on beer, spirits, and wine contributed an estimated $200 million to $300 million annually to the federal budget, roughly equivalent to several billion dollars in modern terms. These revenues had been applied to post-World War I reconstruction, veteran benefits, and the expansion of federal programs. State and municipal governments also collected licensing fees, sales taxes, and other levies associated with the legal trade in alcohol, which provided funding for public services, including police, fire departments, and education. The abrupt cessation of this revenue stream forced governments to adjust budgets, reduce expenditures, and explore alternative sources of taxation. In some cases, the fiscal shortfall increased political pressure to enforce prohibition unevenly, as local authorities faced the trade-off between strict law enforcement and the economic health of their jurisdictions. Employment in the alcohol-related industries was immediately affected. Breweries, distilleries, bottling plants, and saloons had collectively employed tens of thousands of workers. The closure of establishments and conversion to non-alcoholic products or near-beer production displaced these workers, creating localized unemployment, particularly in industrial centers such as Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, and New York. Some displaced workers found employment in alternate manufacturing sectors, soft drink production, or food processing, but these opportunities were insufficient to absorb the total displaced labor force. Skilled workers, such as brewmasters, distillers, and cooperage specialists, often faced underemployment or migration to illegal production networks. The economic impact was compounded by the interconnected nature of the alcohol industry. Suppliers of raw materials, transporters, hospitality staff, and auxiliary trades also experienced declines in demand. Despite the prohibition, alcohol consumption persisted, though its forms changed. Official statistics indicate that legal consumption fell sharply in the early 1920s, but surveys of hospital records, police reports, and health studies suggest that overall consumption, including illegal production, home distillation, and imported alcohol, remained substantial. Individuals and families adapted by producing home-brewed beer or distilled spirits, often in small-scale stills hidden in attics, basements, or barns. These homemade products varied widely in quality and potency, occasionally resulting in toxic byproducts such as methanol poisoning. Industrial alcohol, legally produced for non-consumptive purposes, was frequently diverted, sometimes after chemical denaturation was partially reversed, to create beverage alcohol. The widespread availability of these illegal sources mitigated the intended public health effects of the Prohibition legislation and contributed to a complex risk environment in which individuals were exposed to unregulated and potentially dangerous substances. Socially, the implementation of Prohibition highlighted significant disparities in enforcement and public compliance. Wealthy urban residents often maintained access to alcohol through private clubs, exclusive gatherings, and well-organized supply chains facilitated by bootlegging networks. In contrast, lower-income and working-class populations faced more direct exposure to law enforcement action for minor violations. Police raids, arrests, and fines disproportionately affected the poor, revealing the uneven application of a law that was nominally universal. These disparities eroded public respect for legal authority and contributed to widespread cynicism regarding the fairness and legitimacy of prohibition policies. Simultaneously, cultural attitudes in cities with large immigrant populations, such as New York, Chicago, and Boston, fostered communal resistance to the law, further complicating enforcement efforts. The immediate fiscal effects of prohibition were counterbalanced by the costs of enforcement. Federal, state, and local governments allocated resources to prohibition enforcement, including staffing of the Prohibition Bureau, local police involvement, court processing, and incarceration of violators. While federal agents were underfunded and relatively few in number, the combined enforcement efforts consumed substantial resources, reducing net fiscal benefits. Local law enforcement faced additional pressures from bribes, corruption, and political influence. The selective or inconsistent enforcement further contributed to the perception that compliance was neither universally expected nor uniformly applied. Economic calculations at the time demonstrated that the net financial effect of prohibition was negative in many jurisdictions when enforcement costs were weighed against lost revenue. Public health and safety outcomes were complex and uneven. Advocates of prohibition had predicted a decline in alcohol-related illnesses, accidents, and social problems, including domestic violence and absenteeism in the workforce. Some early studies indicated modest reductions in certain alcohol-related hospitalizations and workplace incidents. However, these effects were offset by new health risks associated with unregulated production. The consumption of improperly distilled spirits led to cases of methanol poisoning, blindness, and fatal overdoses. Law enforcement data and medical reports document thousands of cases annually where improperly produced or chemically altered alcohol caused injury or death. These outcomes revealed the unintended consequences of a policy that sought to improve public health through legal prohibition without establishing mechanisms to regulate or safely substitute for demand. The social landscape of prohibition also reflected broader cultural tensions. Urban-rural divisions persisted, with rural areas generally adhering more closely to prohibition norms due to entrenched religious and social traditions. Urban centers, particularly those with high concentrations of immigrants, continued patterns of alcohol consumption as a normalized social activity. This division was evident in compliance rates, judicial outcomes, and public sentiment. Ethnic communities maintained informal networks to supply alcohol to households and social institutions, reinforcing cultural traditions and highlighting the limits of legal intervention. Municipal authorities in many urban jurisdictions, recognizing the difficulty of fully enforcing prohibition, often tolerated minor infractions or focused enforcement selectively on larger-scale operations, further embedding differential patterns of compliance. Prohibition's impact on crime extended beyond organized bootlegging. Ordinary citizens engaged in illicit production or consumption risked arrest for possession, sale, or transportation of prohibited beverages. Arrest statistics from the early 1920s indicate tens of thousands of prosecutions annually for alcohol-related offenses, placing pressure on courts and local jails. In urban areas, jury nullification became increasingly common, as jurors refused to convict neighbors or community members for acts considered socially acceptable despite their illegality. This phenomenon reflected both resistance to federal authority and the embedded nature of alcohol consumption in everyday life. The resulting legal backlog strained judicial resources and highlighted the practical challenges of enforcing a law that conflicted with prevailing social norms. The cultural and social dynamics of consumption further complicated the enforcement landscape. Speakeasies, private clubs, and underground social spaces emerged to provide controlled environments for drinking. These establishments varied from small neighborhood operations to larger venues integrated with entertainment and dining. Patronage patterns reflected social status, ethnic affiliation, and geographic location, and operators implemented sophisticated measures to protect clients and avoid law enforcement attention. Despite the illegality, these venues reinforced social cohesion within communities, demonstrating that alcohol consumption remained a normative activity and that prohibition had not fundamentally altered societal behavior on a mass scale. Economically, the growth of illegal markets had broader implications. Bootlegging, smuggling, and clandestine production generated substantial revenue, creating employment and supporting secondary industries such as transportation, distribution, and hospitality services associated with clandestine consumption. The illegal economy redirected resources that might otherwise have been taxed, further reducing government revenue while creating financial incentives for criminal networks to expand operations. The combination of legal, economic, and social pressures produced a complex feedback loop in which demand persisted, supply adapted, and enforcement struggled to maintain control. The enforcement and social realities of prohibition also had political consequences. Public dissatisfaction with uneven application and the negative economic impact influenced local, state, and national political discourse. Civic organizations, temperance advocates, and opposition groups debated the effectiveness and morality of enforcement strategies, shaping policy decisions and electoral outcomes. By the mid-1920s, political recognition of enforcement limitations, economic disruption, and widespread noncompliance contributed to discussions. By the late 1920s, public resistance to prohibition in the United States had become increasingly visible and politically significant. While the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act had established a legal framework for prohibiting alcohol, enforcement remained uneven, compliance inconsistent, and social attitudes toward the law increasingly skeptical. Urban centers, in particular, experienced widespread noncompliance as city residents continued to consume alcohol through speakeasies, private clubs, and home production, while law enforcement faced practical and political limits in addressing widespread demand. The gap between law and behavior widened, creating a social and legal environment in which resistance became a structural feature of prohibition rather than an isolated phenomenon. Legal institutions were central to the manifestation of resistance. Courts and prosecutors struggled to process the high volume of alcohol-related cases. Federal and local enforcement statistics from the mid-1920s indicate that tens of thousands of cases were brought annually for violations of the Volstead Act, ranging from possession to illegal production and distribution. Judicial backlogs were common, and in many jurisdictions, juries refused to convict defendants despite clear evidence of violations. Jury nullification reflected both the persistent cultural acceptance of alcohol and widespread public skepticism toward prohibition law. In urban counties with diverse ethnic populations, juries frequently reflected community sentiment, often favoring acquittal to avoid punishing neighbors for acts considered socially acceptable. This trend undermined enforcement efficacy and demonstrated the limits of legal coercion in regulating entrenched social practices. Municipal and state authorities responded variably to public resistance. In some cities, police departments focused on larger-scale criminal operations while ignoring minor infractions, effectively creating a selective enforcement system. Political considerations often shaped enforcement priorities. Officials recognized that aggressive prosecution of ordinary citizens could provoke public backlash, jeopardize electoral support, and exacerbate social tension. Corruption compounded this selective enforcement. Bribery of law enforcement officers, political figures, and judicial officials was widespread, particularly in urban areas where bootlegging operations were well established. These practices created an environment in which illegal supply networks operated with relative impunity, while minor actors faced arbitrary enforcement outcomes. The selective application of prohibition law eroded public confidence in the impartiality and legitimacy of legal institutions, reinforcing a broader pattern of resistance and noncompliance. Civic organizations and social groups played significant roles in both supporting and opposing prohibition, reflecting the evolving political landscape. Early in the 20th century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and other temperance organizations had mobilized public opinion in favor of alcohol restriction, linking consumption to social ills, domestic abuse, and moral degradation. However, by the late 1920s, these groups experienced declining influence. Public attention shifted toward the practical consequences of prohibition, including economic dislocation, organized crime, and inconsistent enforcement. New organizations emerged to challenge the continuation of the 18th Amendment. Among them, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, WNPR, became particularly influential, advocating for repeal on grounds of social harm, failed enforcement, and economic opportunity. These groups mobilized public opinion, coordinated lobbying efforts, and engaged in extensive educational campaigns to raise awareness of the law's unintended consequences. Their activities contributed to a growing national debate regarding the feasibility, morality, and economic impact of prohibition. Political dynamics increasingly reflected public sentiment and organized resistance. By the late 1920s, prominent politicians began addressing the limitations and failures of prohibition in public discourse. Local and state elections increasingly included prohibition as a key issue, with candidates taking positions either in favor of enforcement or supporting modifications or repeal. The shifting political climate was influenced by multiple factors, including economic considerations, social attitudes, and the visible consequences of criminal enterprise associated with illegal alcohol markets. Public opinion surveys, press coverage, and political endorsements reflected a growing recognition that prohibition was not achieving its intended objectives, and that persistent noncompliance, corruption, and social disruption undermined the law's legitimacy. The economic argument against prohibition gained traction during this period. Studies and media reports highlighted the fiscal costs of enforcement and the economic losses from the closure of breweries, distilleries, and related industries. Analysts estimated that the federal government lost hundreds of millions of dollars annually in excise tax revenue, while state and municipal governments faced similar reductions. Concurrently, organized criminal networks captured substantial economic gains from illegal alcohol production and distribution. The disparity between potential revenue from a regulated legal market and profits realized through illicit channels contributed to public skepticism and political debate. Economists, journalists, and civic organizations increasingly presented prohibition as economically inefficient, socially destabilizing, and politically unsustainable. Urban resistance was particularly prominent due to demographic, cultural, and social factors. Cities with large immigrant populations, including New York, Chicago, and Boston, had long-standing cultural traditions of alcohol consumption. Immigrant communities maintained social networks and institutions, such as ethnic clubs, breweries, and taverns, which facilitated continued consumption despite legal prohibitions. The enforcement of prohibition in these contexts faced practical challenges. Police resources were limited, community cooperation was minimal, and social norms favored noncompliance. These urban patterns of resistance reinforced the national perception that prohibition was largely unenforceable in practice, contributing to debates over the law's viability and fairness. Public opinion surveys and contemporary reports from the late 1920s indicate that support for prohibition declined steadily over the decade. While early years showed some reduction in consumption and modest approval among certain demographic groups, subsequent years revealed increasing dissatisfaction. Factors influencing this shift included the persistence of illegal markets, visible organized crime, economic losses, social inequities in enforcement, and practical inconvenience for ordinary citizens. Public discourse in newspapers, magazines, and political forums increasingly emphasized these realities, creating a cultural and political environment conducive to the growth of repeal movements. Resistance also manifested in organized labor and professional networks. Workers in industries displaced by prohibition, including brewing, distilling, bottling, and hospitality, often advocated for modification or repeal to restore employment and economic stability. Trade unions and professional associations lobbied for legislative change, framing prohibition as a barrier to economic opportunity and worker welfare. These economic arguments complemented social and political critiques, contributing to a comprehensive narrative that prohibition was producing negative consequences across multiple sectors of American society. Legal, economic, and social resistance intersected with organized crime and illicit alcohol networks. The proliferation of bootlegging, speakeasies, and smuggling demonstrated the practical limitations of enforcement. Resistance was not merely passive or symbolic. It involved active engagement with illegal markets, leveraging social networks, and exploiting enforcement gaps. The integration of illegal production and distribution into urban and rural economies further complicated enforcement as communities adapted to the realities of persistent demand. Local resistance, therefore, functioned as both a cultural and structural force, influencing legal practices, political discourse, and economic outcomes. The media played a critical role in shaping public perception and amplifying resistance. Newspapers and magazines reported extensively on corruption, enforcement failures, organized crime, and economic consequences, presenting empirical evidence that challenged the moral and social rationale of prohibition. Editorials, investigative journalism, and public letters contributed to a national conversation about the law's effectiveness, fairness, and sustainability. Media coverage often highlighted disparities in enforcement between urban and rural areas, socioeconomic groups, and ethnic communities, reinforcing awareness of systemic inequities and contributing to the erosion of public support. By the end of the 1920s, resistance had shifted the perception of prohibition from a moral and social reform initiative to a policy widely regarded as ineffective and counterproductive. Political and civic leaders, responding to public sentiment, economic realities, and enforcement limitations, increasingly acknowledged the need to reconsider national policy. Resistance was institutionalized through lobbying organizations, media campaigns, and political platforms advocating modification or repeal. It was also embedded in everyday social practice, as ordinary citizens continued to consume alcohol through legal loopholes, home production, and underground markets. This dual manifestation of resistance, formal political activism and widespread social noncompliance, defined the late 1920s as a period of significant challenge to the prohibition framework. The decline in temperance advocacy further reinforced the environment of resistance. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had been central to early 20th century advocacy for alcohol prohibition, experienced declining influence and membership. Public attention shifted to practical issues of enforcement, economic consequences, and social inequities. New organizations, including the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, framed prohibition as a policy failure, emphasizing the law's social, economic, and political costs. These groups mobilized extensive lobbying campaigns, public education initiatives, and media outreach, contributing to the growing national consensus that prohibition required modification or repeal. Resistance at the community level also shaped enforcement priorities. Local law enforcement agencies, recognizing the difficulty of achieving universal compliance, often prioritized larger-scale operations, such as high-volume bootlegging syndicates, while allowing minor infractions to persist. This selective enforcement strategy reflected both practical limitations and public tolerance for small-scale violations. Community norms frequently supported continued consumption in private settings, reinforcing the perception that the law was misaligned with social expectations. The interaction between community practices, enforcement discretion, and organized resistance created a complex and enduring pattern of noncompliance. Economic pressure, social adaptation, legal challenges, and political mobilization converged to shift the national debate over prohibition. By the late 1920s, it was evident that widespread noncompliance, enforcement challenges, and the expansion of organized crime had fundamentally altered the context in which the 18th Amendment operated. Public sentiment increasingly favored modification or repeal, particularly in urban areas, industrial regions, and immigrant communities, while rural and temperance-focused regions maintained support for the law. This division reflected the cultural, social, and economic heterogeneity of the United States, highlighting the practical difficulties of enforcing a uniform national prohibition policy. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 significantly altered the political, economic, and social context of prohibition in the United States, intensifying pressures for repeal and reshaping national priorities regarding alcohol regulation. The stock market crash of October 1929 triggered a chain reaction across financial markets, banks, and industrial production, leading to widespread unemployment, declining consumer demand, and severe fiscal constraints on federal, state, and local governments. The economic collapse exposed the vulnerabilities of prohibition as a national policy and created new incentives for reconsidering alcohol legislation as a potential source of revenue, employment, and social stabilization. Federal and state governments faced immediate fiscal crises. The sudden decline in tax revenues from personal income, corporate earnings, and property assessments was compounded by the absence of excise taxes on alcohol, which had previously provided hundreds of millions of dollars annually to the federal treasury. Estimates indicate that pre-prohibition excise taxes on alcohol contributed roughly $200 million to $300 million annually to federal revenues, representing a substantial portion of discretionary spending. The loss of these funds during a period of unprecedented economic contraction heightened interest among policymakers in identifying new revenue streams. Legalization of alcohol production and sale presented a politically viable and financially significant option, promising both immediate tax income and potential employment generation through the reactivation of breweries, distilleries, and associated supply chains. The economic imperative for repeal extended to employment and industrial production. Prohibition had disrupted employment in brewing, distilling, hospitality, transportation, and agriculture sectors, contributing to structural unemployment in urban and rural regions alike. The onset of the Depression intensified these pressures as industrial and commercial decline left millions without jobs. Advocates for repeal highlighted the capacity of a legal alcohol industry to generate immediate employment opportunities for displaced workers, including brewery and distillery laborers, truck drivers, hospitality staff, and agricultural producers of grains, fruits, and hops. The argument framed legal alcohol production as a tool for both fiscal recovery and social stabilization, aligning economic necessity with public policy objectives during a period of national crisis. Political actors responded to the economic and social realities with increasing urgency. Prominent members of both major parties began openly advocating for the modification or repeal of prohibition, citing practical enforcement failures, economic inefficiency, and the fiscal benefits of legalization. In the 1932 presidential campaign, Franklin D. Roosevelt, representing the Democratic Party, explicitly endorsed repeal, positioning it as part of a broader platform addressing unemployment, economic recovery, and federal reform. Roosevelt's campaign highlighted the potential for substantial federal tax revenue and job creation through regulated alcohol markets. His approach reflected an understanding that public sentiment had shifted decisively against prohibition, with urban populations, labor organizations, and business interests increasingly favoring modification or repeal. Media coverage amplified the economic and political arguments for repeal. Newspapers, magazines, and periodicals published analyses of the costs of prohibition enforcement, the scale of lost tax revenues, and the economic potential of legalized alcohol. Investigative reporting frequently highlighted the inefficiency of enforcement agencies, the scope of organized crime profits, and the continued social prevalence of alcohol consumption. Editorials framed prohibition as an economic burden and a source of social disruption rather than a moral improvement, contributing to a national consensus that policy change was both necessary and pragmatic. Public discourse increasingly emphasized measurable fiscal and economic outcomes over ideological or moral rationales, reflecting a shift in the priorities of both citizens and policymakers. The legal framework for considering repeal emerged through both federal legislation and political mobilization. Congress introduced and debated multiple bills in the early 1930s aimed at modifying the Volstead Act or facilitating the repeal of the 18th Amendment. The Blaine Act, introduced in 1933, represented the culmination of these legislative efforts, providing a clear mechanism for ratification and formal repeal. Political strategy during this period reflected the need to balance state and local autonomy with federal policy objectives. Advocates for repeal argued that state-level regulation could maintain public order and control over alcohol distribution, while simultaneously capturing economic benefits for local and national governments. This approach aligned with public preference for moderated regulation over absolute prohibition, reinforcing the perception that a controlled legal market could satisfy both social and fiscal objectives. Public sentiment during the Depression underscored the intersection of economic necessity and social behavior. Surveys, editorial commentary, and anecdotal reports suggested that citizens increasingly viewed prohibition as a failed experiment that imposed economic costs, restricted personal freedom, and exacerbated social inequalities. Working class and urban populations, in particular, expressed frustration with selective enforcement, high prices in illegal markets, and limited legal avenues for consumption. The convergence of public dissatisfaction with economic hardship created a receptive environment for political leaders advocating repeal, particularly when framed in terms of job creation, government revenue, and community stabilization. The economic dimension of repeal extended beyond direct tax revenues and employment. Legalization of alcohol promised to stimulate secondary economic activity, including the construction of breweries and bars, production and transportation of raw materials, and associated retail and service industries. Agricultural sectors producing barley, hops, corn, and fruit stood to benefit from renewed demand, while manufacturing and distribution networks could absorb additional labor and capital investment. Estimates from contemporary studies suggested that legalization could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in both federal and state revenues annually, while simultaneously reintegrating thousands of workers into formal employment channels. These projections formed the basis for widespread advocacy among business associations, trade unions, and civic organizations, linking economic recovery directly to repeal. The political calculus of repeal was influenced by demographic and geographic variations in support. Urban areas, with high concentrations of immigrant populations and working-class communities, demonstrated sustained resistance to prohibition and strong support for modification or repeal. Rural and religious constituencies, particularly in the South and Midwest, retained moral and ideological support for prohibition measures, though even these regions faced economic pressures during the Depression that tempered rigid opposition to policy change. Legislators navigated these competing interests, balancing moral concerns with fiscal imperatives and constituent demand. National political campaigns increasingly framed repeal as a pragmatic response to economic crisis rather than a purely moral issue, facilitating legislative consensus in favor of modification. Organized crime continued to influence the political and social landscape during this period. Syndicates that had profited from bootlegging during the 1920s remained active, controlling distribution networks, urban speakeasies, and smuggling operations. The persistence of criminal networks highlighted the ineffectiveness of enforcement and contributed to the public perception that Prohibition had inadvertently strengthened organized crime. Policymakers and civic leaders leveraged these observations to argue that repeal, coupled with regulated legal markets, could reduce criminal influence, restore lawful economic activity, and improve social stability. The experience of the 1920s underscored that moral legislation imposed without realistic enforcement mechanisms could produce unintended and persistent consequences. Resistance movements, civic advocacy, and media coverage coalesced to create a political environment conducive to repeal. Organizations such as the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform actively lobbied Congress, coordinated public awareness campaigns, and mobilized voting blocs to advocate for change. Newspapers published analyses highlighting the fiscal, social, and political costs of maintaining prohibition during an economic crisis. Public discourse is increasingly focused on pragmatic concerns, such as revenue generation, employment, and public order, rather than ideological adherence to temperance principles. This confluence of factors created a tipping point in national sentiment, aligning public, political, and economic pressures toward the repeal of the 18th Amendment. The federal government's policy response involved both legislative and administrative planning. Lawmakers evaluated mechanisms to reestablish legal alcohol markets while ensuring regulatory oversight, taxation, and state-level autonomy. Proposals included licensing systems for production and distribution, taxation schemes designed to capture both federal and state revenues, and enforcement frameworks aimed at reducing illegal competition and criminal influence. Policymakers also considered public health implications, emphasizing quality control, consumer safety, and prevention of underage access. These measures reflected lessons learned from the limitations of prohibition enforcement, highlighting the need for a controlled and legally regulated alcohol economy. By early 1932, the momentum for repeal had become decisive. Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidential campaign explicitly endorsed the end of prohibition, framing it as both an economic and social necessity. Polling data, election outcomes, and legislative activity demonstrated broad public support for repeal, particularly among urban, working-class, and immigrant populations. Economic studies presented to Congress underscored the potential benefits of legalization in terms of tax revenue, employment, and industrial recovery. These analyses were instrumental in shaping both political strategy and public perception, reinforcing the argument that prohibition, as implemented during the 1920s, had failed to achieve its stated objectives and had imposed unnecessary economic and social costs. The Depression-era context accelerated the alignment of social, economic, and political factors in favor of repeal. Economic hardship highlighted the tangible benefits of legal alcohol markets, while public sentiment increasingly rejected the continued imposition of a law widely regarded as unenforceable and socially counterproductive. Policymakers, civic organizations, and media outlets emphasized measurable outcomes, employment, revenue, industrial production, over moralistic rhetoric, framing repeal as both a pragmatic and urgent policy response. This confluence of pressures created a unique historical window in which national policy could be reconsidered, setting the stage for the legislative and constitutional processes that culminated in the Blaine Act and the eventual ratification of the 21st Amendment in 1933. In 1933, the United States entered the final stage of its 13-year experiment with national prohibition, as the cumulative social, economic, and political pressures converged to make repeal both feasible and necessary. The process of ending prohibition involved coordinated legislative action, state-level ratification procedures, and the creation of a legal framework for regulated alcohol production, distribution, and consumption. The culmination of this process was the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which formally repealed the 18th Amendment, marking the only instance in American history of one constitutional amendment nullifying another. The transition from a nationwide ban to regulated legality required careful planning to restore industry, generate revenue, and manage public order, while addressing the entrenched illegal markets and institutional structures created during the Prohibition era. The legislative groundwork for repeal began with the introduction of bills in Congress aimed at amending or nullifying Prohibition laws. Among these, the Blaine Act, formally designated as House Joint Resolution 681, was the key instrument directing the repeal process. Passed by Congress in February 1933, the Blaine Act proposed the repeal of the 18th Amendment through ratification by state legislatures. It established the legal authority for states to regulate the sale and distribution of alcohol independently, thereby decentralizing control and aligning regulation with local preferences and political realities. The act reflected lessons learned from the prior enforcement failures, emphasizing state autonomy to manage licensing, taxation, and public safety, while restoring national oversight over interstate commerce and importation of alcoholic beverages. Following congressional approval, the Blaine Act moved to the states for ratification. Ratification required approval by 3/4 of the 50 states, a process that was expedited due to overwhelming public and political support for repeal. State legislatures acted swiftly, recognizing the dual incentives of social demand and economic opportunity. Urban states, industrial centers, and regions with large immigrant populations led the ratification effort, reflecting widespread support for legal alcohol markets. Rural states, many of which had historically supported temperance movements, engaged in more deliberative processes, balancing cultural and religious considerations against the fiscal and employment benefits of repeal. By December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment had been ratified, officially ending federal prohibition and returning regulatory authority primarily to the states. The transition from illegal to legal alcohol required the re-establishment of production and distribution infrastructure. Breweries, distilleries, wineries, and bottling plants, many of which had ceased operation or converted to alternative products during Prohibition, resumed activity under state licensing schemes. This reactivation created immediate employment opportunities for thousands of displaced workers, including skilled brewers, distillers, cooperage workers, transporters, and hospitality employees. Agricultural sectors supplying raw materials, such as barley, corn, hops, and grapes, experienced renewed demand, stabilizing rural economies that had been weakened by the closure of legal alcohol markets. Industrial planning incorporated both large-scale corporate production and smaller, craft-oriented operations, reflecting the diversity of the pre-Prohibition alcohol economy. Regulatory frameworks established by state governments varied in scope and detail. Some states permitted widespread commercial sale through licensed retailers, restaurants, and bars, while others maintained restrictions on hours of sale, locations, and types of beverages permitted. Control states, including some in the South and Midwest, implemented government monopolies or strict licensing systems to manage distribution, capture revenue, and mitigate potential social harms. Legal oversight included taxation structures designed to capture excise revenue at production, distribution, and retail stages, generating funds for both state and federal governments. These regulatory mechanisms were informed by experiences during Prohibition, prioritizing enforceable compliance, quality control, and reduction of criminal influence in the alcohol trade. The economic impact of repeal was immediate and measurable. Estimates indicate that re-legalized alcohol markets generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually in federal and state tax revenue, contributing significantly to Depression-era recovery efforts. Employment expanded rapidly as displaced workers returned to brewing, distilling, transportation, and hospitality sectors. Secondary industries, including glass and metal manufacturing for bottles, transportation logistics, and food and beverage services, also benefited from renewed demand. The reactivation of legal markets redirected consumer spending from black market products to regulated, taxable goods, restoring government revenue streams and reducing incentives for organized criminal operations in the alcohol sector. Public order and law enforcement considerations were central to the post-repeal transition. State and local authorities worked to integrate regulatory oversight with existing policing structures, emphasizing prevention of underage sales, quality control, and the suppression of residual illegal operations. Federal enforcement continued to manage interstate commerce and importation, ensuring that legal markets operated within established standards and did not conflict with state regulations. The dismantling of large-scale bootlegging operations required coordination between law enforcement, judicial authorities, and community organizations, reflecting the complexity of transitioning from an entrenched illicit economy to a regulated market. Social adaptation accompanied legal and economic changes. Communities that had relied on speakeasies, private clubs, and underground networks gradually shifted toward licensed establishments. Consumer behavior reflected a combination of pent-up demand and habitual consumption patterns developed during Prohibition. Data from post-repeal surveys indicate that overall alcohol consumption initially rose as legal supply became available, then stabilized under regulated conditions. Public health authorities monitored consumption patterns and associated risks, incorporating lessons from the unregulated period of the 1920s to inform educational campaigns and quality control measures. The legacy of organized crime was a significant consideration during the repeal transition. Syndicates that had flourished under Prohibition faced the challenge of integrating or exiting markets now dominated by legal, regulated competition. Some criminal networks redirected operations toward other illegal activities, including narcotics, gambling, and labor racketeering, while others sought to participate in legitimate distribution through licensing or partnership with commercial enterprises. Law enforcement and regulatory authorities continued to monitor the residual influence of these networks, leveraging taxation, licensing, and legal oversight to minimize the potential for criminal disruption in newly legalized markets. Public discourse in the immediate post-repeal period emphasized both the restoration of personal liberty and the practical benefits of regulation. Newspapers, journals, and civic organizations framed repeal as a corrective measure to a failed social experiment, highlighting economic recovery, public safety, and alignment with social norms. Commentary also addressed moral and cultural implications, noting the persistence of alcohol consumption throughout Prohibition and the need for realistic regulatory frameworks. The discourse reflected a broader national reconciliation with the failures and consequences of Prohibition, positioning repeal as a pragmatic and historically necessary policy adjustment. State-level regulation produced diverse outcomes, reflecting regional cultural, social, and political factors. Some states, particularly in the South, retained partial restrictions or control measures, limiting the sale of certain types of alcoholic beverages or restricting commercial access. Others, particularly in urban centers, permitted relatively unrestricted access through licensed establishments, creating localized markets with strong commercial incentives. The heterogeneity of state approaches demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of the American federal system in responding to complex social and economic challenges, balancing local preference with national oversight. Economic stabilization continued through the integration of previously illicit producers into the regulated market. Entrepreneurs, former bootleggers, and existing commercial operators transitioned to licensed production, leveraging accumulated expertise and distribution networks. The expansion of legal markets contributed to broader consumer confidence, supported employment, and restored industrial activity. Data from tax records, production reports, and labor statistics indicate a rapid recovery in both urban and rural economies, underscoring the significant economic role of alcohol markets in national fiscal policy and industrial planning during the early 1930s. The legal and regulatory transition also included quality control, consumer safety, and health oversight measures. Licensing requirements mandated adherence to production standards, labeling, and storage protocols. State and federal authorities monitored compliance, conducting inspections, testing products, and enforcing penalties for violations. Public health initiatives emphasized the risks associated with overconsumption and unsafe production practices, incorporating lessons learned from the hazardous alcohol that had circulated during Prohibition. These measures reflected an evolved understanding of regulatory necessity, linking economic recovery with consumer protection and public safety. The societal impact of repeal extended beyond economics and public order. Cultural norms regarding alcohol consumption adjusted to the availability of a regulated supply. Social institutions, including restaurants, bars, clubs, and hospitality venues, adapted to legal frameworks, creating structured environments for consumption. Community engagement with alcohol shifted from clandestine activity to public and regulated participation, influencing social behavior, recreational practices, and community economics. These changes contributed to the normalization of consumption patterns, integration of economic activity, and restoration of governance legitimacy in areas previously dominated by illicit markets. Political dynamics evolved in the aftermath of repeal. Federal and state governments coordinated to ensure the smooth implementation of licensing, taxation, and enforcement frameworks. Legislative attention focused on refining regulatory measures, resolving disputes over jurisdiction, and monitoring the transition from illegal to legal markets. Public policy objectives emphasized revenue generation, employment restoration, social stability, and the reduction of criminal influence. Political actors leveraged successful implementation to demonstrate responsiveness to public demand and effective governance, consolidating support for regulated markets and affirming federal-state cooperation. The transition period also involved international considerations. Legal alcohol imports and exports were managed to ensure compliance with both domestic regulations and international trade agreements. Ports, customs authorities, and transport networks adapted to renewed legal commerce, incorporating licensing, inspection, and taxation protocols. These measures reflected the global dimension of alcohol markets and underscored the importance of coordinated oversight to maintain both economic benefit and legal compliance in the post-Prohibition environment. By December 1933, the legal, economic, and social transition following the ratification of the 21st Amendment had established a framework for regulated alcohol in the United States. Federal repeal restored authority to the states, enabling localized management of production, distribution, and consumption. Industrial recovery, employment expansion, and revenue generation were immediate and measurable, while law enforcement and regulatory agencies worked to suppress residual illegal markets and integrate formerly illicit actors into legal frameworks. Public adaptation to legalized alcohol, combined with regulatory oversight and fiscal planning, created a stabilized environment that contrasted sharply with the enforcement challenges and social disruption experienced during the preceding 13 years. The immediate aftermath of repeal demonstrated the interconnected consequences of prolonged prohibition, illustrating the balance between legal authority, economic policy, public behavior, and regulatory oversight. Restored employment and industrial activity highlighted the economic significance of alcohol production and distribution, while tax revenues contributed directly to government capacity during a period of national recovery from the Depression. Social adaptation and the reintegration of consumption into regulated channels underscored the persistence of cultural practices despite legal restriction, reflecting the limitations of moralistic legislation divorced from social reality. Law enforcement and regulatory measures established frameworks to reduce criminal influence and ensure compliance, integrating lessons learned from prohibition into practical governance mechanisms. The repeal period also illuminated the broader implications of constitutional policy, demonstrating the ability of the federal system to adapt to social, economic, and political realities. The 21st Amendment reinforced state authority over alcohol regulation while maintaining national oversight on interstate commerce and importation, providing a model for balancing federal and local control in complex policy domains. The transition emphasized the importance of enforceable regulations, fiscal incentives, and public engagement in shaping policy outcomes, offering a comprehensive example of the interplay between legislation, social behavior, and economic imperatives in American governance.